I moved all of my pension and savings into a new account, leaving only $50 in the old one. The next morning, my son kicked my door open, grabbed my collar tightly, and shouted, "Where is the money? Tell me right now!" His wife rushed straight into my late wife's bedroom, ripping through every drawer and forcing open every jewelry box. I just stood there silently smiling because I had already prepared everything. 10 minutes later, both of them completely fell apart. That February of Friday morning, my front door didn't ease open the way doors are supposed to. It took a beating. 3 heavy slaps against the wood, then a 4th blow, then a 5th. I hadn't even managed to haul myself up from the armchair before the window glass was trembling in its frames. The coffee mug sitting on the side table skittered a good half-inch across the surface. There's something I need you to know before this story goes any further. 68 years old. 35 years I spent threading my body through HVAC units into attics and crawl spaces all over Fresno. A flashlight clenched between my teeth, a wrench in either hand doing that work in heat that pushed past 110 degrees. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here with me tonight. Before we get into it, drop a comment and tell me what the weather looks like where you are right now. There's something about a cold, quiet morning that has a way of sharpening the mind, and this story has a few of those. A quick note, some elements of this story have been shaped for audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific living people or events is coincidental. What matters here is the truth underneath it, and that part is very real. 6 in the morning, and I was planted in my hallway, listening to a grown man beat on my front door, like he wanted it off its hinges. I'm not somebody who rattles, but something happened in my chest right then that I couldn't name. I got the door open. Colt was already through it before the latch had fully cleared, not shoving past me, just occupying the space I was standing in, the way a draft fills a room before you've even noticed the window is open. Gray jacket one I'd never seen on him, and a look on his face I hadn't witnessed since he was 9 years old, the morning he put a baseball through the garage window and realized I'd already figured it out. Where is it? Where's what? Don't. That word came apart in his mouth. Split right down the middle. Don't do that, Dad. The account. It's empty. Where did the money go? And then Lacey was in the doorway behind him. What she did next is the part I keep returning to, months later, still unable to set it down. No pause at the entry, no glance in my direction. She turned left and moved down the hall toward the back of the house. And seconds after that, I heard the bedroom door come open. Vivian's room. Unchanged since January of the previous year, her reading glasses still sitting folded on the nightstand, exactly where she'd left them, because moving them was something I hadn't been able to do. A drawer pulled open, another, then the closet track. Colt closed the gap between us. Dad, look at me. Where is the money? I answered him, at the same register I'd use explaining a repair to a frustrated customer, level no heat in it. Not because I'd found any calm, I hadn't. Both hands were balled up inside my pockets, knuckles straining at the fabric. What money do you mean exactly? $187,000. Delivered like he was reading off a dial. Vivian's inheritance. 3 days ago it was in the joint account. Right now it shows $50. I want to know where the difference went. Let me stop on that for a second, because what landed wasn't the fury of it, it was the precision. He had the exact figure. He knew precisely when it had last been there. He had it to the penny. A son who drops by to check on his old man doesn't carry the balance of that man's savings account in his head down to the dollar. A son who's been hovering over that account like a hawk on a fence post. That son knows it to the dollar. Something dropped in the back of the house. Heavy sounded like a box. Then I heard the jewelry chest. Wooden sat on Vivian's dresser for 40 years, handed down from her mother, with that little brass clasp that wouldn't give unless you knew the trick lift first then press. I heard Lacey go at it without knowing the trick. Something clenched in my chest that had nothing to do with my cardiovascular system. Colt was across the room in 4 strides. Both hands up, fists wrapped in my collar, and then my shoulders were against the wall next to the coat hooks. He wasn't trying to damage me, I want to say that plainly. It was measured deliberate the way you'd wedge a door. But I was 68 and he was 41 with 4 inches on me, and his face was close enough that I could make out the red threading through the whites of his eyes. You're going to tell me where that account is, right now. I had maybe 2 seconds before I had to choose. Pushing back was what every muscle in me was angled toward. Something primal kicks in when a man's own walls are being used against him, in the home he holds the deed to. My body had a plan. 35 years hauling compressor units up staircases had put things in my arms and shoulders that Colt wasn't factoring in. But I'd had 11 days to think through this exact moment, so I went still. I stood there and let my son pin his father to the wall of his father's house in the hallway his father painted in 1986, 6 inches left of the coat hooks his father put in himself in 1993. I let him hold me there. I didn't raise so much as a finger. What I did was look up, above the front door where the ceiling and wall come together at a slight pitch that corner. 8 days prior, I'd been up a stepladder for about 20 minutes, and what I'd fixed to that corner was a small matte black rectangle, the sort of thing any hardware store in California carries for under $100. A doorbell camera. Audra had told me not to go at Colt directly yet, and I'd taken her advice and used the time instead. 8 days of continuous recording. The little red light was doing what it does. I held my eyes on it, then brought them back down to my son's face. Colt, steadier than I had any right to sound. This is the first time I've ever wished you could hear yourself the way everyone else does. He didn't catch it immediately. I watched the sequence move across him, confusion first, then a flash of irritation, then something that hardened behind his eyes. Then his gaze went where mine had been. He found the lens. Both hands dropped from my collar like he'd grabbed something burning. One step back, then another, until he'd drifted to the center of the room, arms loose at his sides. The expression that settled on him, I'd seen that exact look once before on a job on a man who'd been completely certain a piece of equipment was dead, and then watched it run. From the hallway entrance Lacey materialized, empty-handed, nothing found. She looked at Colt. Colt looked at the camera. 10 minutes after that front door had shaken on its frame, every cubic inch of that room was still. But if you've concluded that what you just heard is the opening of this story, you've started in the wrong place. The real beginning is 14 months back, a January morning cold, the first time I drove home from the hospital, and Vivian wasn't in the car. They gave me a plastic bag at discharge. That is the sharpest memory I carry from the last morning of January 2022. Not the route home. Not what the house looked like from the driveway. Not the precise texture of the quiet that settled on me when I got the front door open and stepped into a kitchen, still holding the scent of coffee Vivian had brewed the morning they admitted her 11 days before. The bag is what stays, knotted at the top, her reading glasses inside it, her wedding ring, the small spiral notebook she'd kept in her coat pocket for 20 years because she'd decided her memory was no longer to be trusted, and she'd rather put things on paper. I placed that bag on the kitchen counter and left it sealed for 6 days. Vivian Hadley was 66 years old when she died. 31 years as a registered nurse, the final 18 of them in the cardiac unit at Community Regional Medical Center, which is the kind of posting that trains you to size up a room in about 4 seconds and separate what's genuinely happening from what somebody wants you to believe is happening. 5'4", gray in her hair, which she'd stopped contesting somewhere around 2014, worn short and no nonsense the same way she ran every other part of her life. She made the finest chicken and rice soup I have ever put in my mouth. She laughed when something earned it and sat quiet when it didn't, which reads as a small thing until you've spent enough time around people who do the opposite. We found each other in 1981 at a hardware store on Blackstone Avenue. I was after a pipe fitting. She was picking up glazing compounds. She'd decided to reglaze her own bathroom window and had no intention of dialing anyone for help. She asked whether she'd gotten the right grade. I said she hadn't. She said she suspected I was correct, but planned to go ahead regardless. 11 months after that conversation, we were married. 40 years and 4 months. That is the span of time we kept a life in the house on Camellia Court. We took title in 1982 for $82,000 in a period when that block was regarded as a fallback option, the kind of address people chose when they had given up on the bigger lots out east. 3 coats of paint on those walls, all of them applied by our own hands. The back addition went up in 1990. I put the storage shelves in the garage the summer Colt turned 8. He stood beside me the whole time, passing me screws and firing questions about every tool I touched. I answered each one, and he held on to every answer. Vivian's attorney, a thorough woman named Robin Tilgman, had helped Vivian establish a living trust 4 years before she died. In California, a living trust passes your assets straight to the named beneficiary, no probate court, no months of delay, no public record. Vivian had named me as sole beneficiary. The house, the savings, the $187,000 she had built up across 31 years of nursing shifts and disciplined spending, and a tightness about money that I'd ribbed her about for 4 decades. All of it came to me cleanly, legally, quietly within weeks of her death. Colt knew an inheritance existed. We had told him that much. The specific figure and the trust structure behind it, those we'd kept to ourselves. Because Vivian had said something in a conversation I still turn over in my mind. There's a difference between a child knowing his parents are comfortable and a child knowing the precise number. The precise number, she said, changes people in ways they don't see coming. I'd agreed with her at the time, without really grasping it. I grasp it now. That first week alone in the house was the strangest stretch of my adult life. I'm not somebody who requires company to get through a day. 35 years of working in attics and mechanical rooms trained me to be at ease with silence. But there's a gap between the quiet of a place where no one else is present and the quiet of a place where someone was present for 40 years and isn't anymore. The first kind of quiet is simply the absence of noise. The second kind carries mass. It settles onto the furniture. It occupies doorways. It trails you through every room without asking. 3 nights running, I ate cereal for dinner because cooking for one person in the kitchen, where Vivian and I had cooked side by side for 4 decades, was something I couldn't bring myself to do. I slept on my side of the bed. Her reading glasses stayed folded on the nightstand. I left the small green cardigan on the hook by the back door, where she had hung it the morning they took her to the hospital, because moving it felt like arriving at a decision I hadn't earned yet. On the 3rd evening, I settled into the armchair by the front window and watched the street lamp flicker on at dusk, the same way Vivian and I had watched it together maybe 10,000 times. And for about 20 minutes, I spoke to her out loud. I told her the soup in the refrigerator was gone. I told her Vivian's clay pot she grew lavender in every summer was sitting dry on the back porch. I told her I had no idea what I was doing. She didn't answer. Of course she didn't. But I'll be straight with you. I kept going anyway because some part of me was convinced she was listening, and still is. On the 3rd of February, Colt called. His voice had shifted from the last time we'd spoken, which was at the reception after the funeral, when he'd held my arm briefly near the coat. Rack said he was sorry, and I'd nodded and said, I knew. This Tuesday evening he sounded slower, gentler. He asked how I was sleeping. He asked whether I was eating. He asked if anything around the house needed attention. I remember sitting in that same armchair, phone pressed to my ear, and feeling something unlock in my chest that had been knotted tight since the hospital. My son was calling to check on me. After years of distance-clipped visits and conversations that seemed to tap out before they got anywhere, my son was on the phone asking whether anything in the house needed fixing. I told him the kitchen light had been flickering for a week. He said he'd swing by Saturday and sort it out. After I hung up, I sat there thinking, maybe losing Vivian shook something loose in him. Maybe that's what grief does, sometimes breaks open what had gone hard and shut. I wasn't wrong that grief breaks things open. I was wrong about which thing had cracked, and wrong about the direction it went. That Saturday, Colt arrived with a voltage tester, a 6-pack of Modelo, and an expression I hadn't seen on him since he was maybe 14. Focused, actually present. The look of someone who had resolved to show up all the way instead of halfway. He had the kitchen light sorted in about 20 minutes loose connection in the fixture, which I'd suspected but hadn't gotten to, because getting to things had become harder since January. No ceremony about it. He went up on the step stool, did what needed doing, came back down and said, "You should have called me sooner, Dad." I told him I hadn't wanted to be a burden. He held my gaze for a beat with an expression I couldn't fully decode and said, "You're not a bother." We sat at the kitchen table after and worked through 2 of the beers, talking about nothing that mattered the way fathers and sons sometimes do, when the habit of discussing anything real has gone rusty and you have to find your way back through low-stakes territory first. He asked about the HVAC unit in the back bedroom. He asked whether the water heater had been looked at lately. He asked if I'd want him back the following weekend to deal with the fence along the east side of the yard, which had been canting since a windstorm in December. I said yes to all of it. He came back that next Saturday and the one after. By the 3rd week of February, Colt was ringing me every morning around 8, a 5-minute check-in, nothing more. Just his voice and mine, and the ordinary motion of a conversation between a father and a son. How'd I sleep? Was I eating? Did I need anything from the hardware store or the grocery? I want to give you an honest account of what those weeks felt like, because it matters for everything that follows. They felt like relief. the particular relief of someone who has been carrying a load for a long time and has finally been shown somewhere to put it down. Asking for help doesn't come naturally to me. 35 years alone in mechanical spaces builds a self-sufficiency that eventually stops being a habit and becomes part of how you see yourself. And here was my son showing up again and again without being summoned. I mentioned it to Faye on one of our Sunday evening calls. "I think losing Vivian woke something up in him," I said. Faye went quiet for a moment, then said, "That's good, Vernon. I hope you're right." She said it carefully. I registered the care in her voice and set it aside without examining it, because wanting to be right felt more pressing than wanting to be cautious. The fourth Saturday in February, Colt came over and brought Lacey. I want to be exact about my first impression of her, because first impressions are the things we tend to revise later to match what we eventually discover, and I'm making an effort not to do that. My initial read on Lacey that afternoon was that she was polished, well put together, and that she moved through a space with the particular ease of someone who has already decided any room she enters will conform to her. She was 38 years old. She ran a medical aesthetics clinic in Clovis, the kind of business that involves lasers and injectables, and the management of other people's insecurities about how they look. Colt had said she was good at it, and in watching her step into my front entryway and shrug off her coat, I believed him. "It's so nice to finally spend some real time here, Vernon," she said. I told her it was good to have her. She gave me a smile, and then her eyes moved. Not quickly, nothing that would read as anything beyond ordinary curiosity if you weren't paying attention. But they swept across the front room, the way a property assessor's eyes sweep a room, cataloging without seeming to catalog. Ceiling first, then the windows, then the hardwood floors, then the fireplace. She asked when the house was built. I told her 1960, though we'd done significant work on it across the years. She nodded and said, "Good bones," then asked if she could use the bathroom. I pointed her down the hall. She was gone considerably longer than a bathroom visit warrants. Colt and I sat in the kitchen while she was back there, and he talked about work, and I listened, and I told myself she was probably just poking around out of curiosity about the place where Colt had grown up. That's a reasonable thing to be curious about. That's what I told myself. After lunch, she asked to see the backyard. I walked her out through the back door, and she stood on the patio and studied the lot line on the left, then the right. Then she asked how far the lot extended. I told her roughly 140 FT to the back fence. She nodded slowly, lips pressed together the way people press them when they're running figures and don't want you to notice. The following Thursday evening, Colt called and stayed on longer than his usual. We talked for maybe 40 minutes. Near the end of it, he said, "Dad, I've been thinking you've got a lot to keep track of the accounts, the bills, all the automatic payments Vivian used to handle. Online banking can get tangled up fast. And honestly, it's how people get taken advantage of if they're not watching. I'd feel better if I came by and helped you get it squared away. Set up the app, right? Make sure everything's running the way it should." I said that sounded useful. He said he'd bring his laptop, it wouldn't take long. He came over that Friday. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and my phone and walked me through the bank's mobile app, where to find the balance, how to check recent transactions, how to set up alerts for large withdrawals. Patient clear didn't make me feel slow for not knowing things, which I appreciated. What I missed because I wasn't watching for it was that he'd also pulled up a secondary settings screen while my back was turned during the 45 seconds I spent refilling our coffee cups. In that window, he saved the login credentials to a password manager on his own phone and reconfigured the account's notification settings so every transaction alert would mirror to a second device, his device. I came back and handed him his cup. "So I just tap here to see the balance. That's all you have to do, Dad?" he said. "Easy." He smiled when he said it. And here's the part I have to tell you, because without it, the rest of the story won't hold together. It was a genuine smile. I have turned that moment over from every direction in the 14 months since, and I cannot locate anything false in it. In March of 2022, when my son sat at my kitchen table and helped me navigate my banking app, he wasn't yet the man who would shove me against my own hallway wall 11 months later. When rot takes hold of a person, it rarely announces itself at the outset. It begins somewhere out of sight, and by the time you catch the smell, it's been working for a good long while. There's something I absorbed in 35 years of HVAC work that has nothing to do with refrigerant or airflow or wiring diagrams. It's the distinction between a person who looks at something and a person who assesses it. A homeowner looks at their unit, they see a metal box that either runs or doesn't. A technician assesses it. Their eyes go to specific points in a deliberate sequence, collecting specific information, and when they're finished, they know something the homeowner has no way of seeing. The second time Lacey came to the house on Camellia Court, I watched her assess it. A Saturday in mid-March, one of those Fresno afternoons, where the late light pours in through the front windows at a low angle and makes everything look warmer than it actually is. Colt was in the kitchen with me, working out why the garbage disposal had started grinding on startup. Lacey was in the front room, and at some point I went down the hall to pull a screwdriver from the utility drawer, and I paused in the doorway and watched her for a moment before she registered me. She was standing in the center of the room, arms loosely folded, head tilted, maybe 15 degrees to the right. Her gaze moved from the front window to the fireplace, to the ceiling, to the far wall, and back again in a slow, deliberate circuit. Not the way someone looks at a room they're visiting, the way someone looks at a room they're pricing out. She noticed me, and the smile came up immediately, the kind that arrives a half beat after the eyes have adjusted rather than in the same instant. "I was just thinking how much light this room gets," she said. "You must love it in the mornings." I said, "We did, Vivian especially." She nodded. "How long have you had those floors?" I told her we'd refinished them in 2008. She made a small approving sound and said, "They're in beautiful shape." Then Colt called from the kitchen that he thought he'd found the problem with the disposal, and Lacey turned toward his voice and the conversation was done. I stood in the hallway for a moment after she moved, holding the screwdriver, turning over what I'd just seen, the way you turn a component in your hand when something about it isn't sitting right. Then I talked myself out of it, told myself I was reading too much into a woman standing in a room. I was wrong, but I decided that anyway. She did the same thing in the backyard 20 minutes later. Colt and I were on the patio going over the fence situation, the section that had been listing since December, and Lacey drifted out through the back door and walked the perimeter of the yard at an easy pace, her eyes tracking along the lot lines. She stopped at the rear fence and looked back at the distance between it and the house, the way a surveyor eyes a parcel. Then she turned and studied the back of the house from that distance, and I could see the arithmetic running behind her eyes. "It's a big lot for this part of Fresno," she said. I told her it was about 140 FT deep, the same figure I'd already given her the first time she'd asked. She said, "That's valuable. Not lovely, not spacious, valuable." Colt glanced at her, then at me, and said something about the fence posts needing to be reset in concrete. The moment moved on, and I let it. Here is what I should not have let pass. I should have been paying attention to the fact that across 2 full visits to my house, Lacey had not once asked about Vivian. Not one question. Not what Vivian had been like, not how long we'd been married, not what she had done for work, not what she had loved about the house she'd spent 40 years in. The woman who had been my wife for 4 decades, whose absence was still audible in every room, did not exist for Lacey as a person. She existed as a previous occupant. I noticed this. I logged it and set it aside. I told myself some people find grief uncomfortable and don't know how to approach it, which is a reasonable thing to tell yourself about someone. You're making an effort to, because your son does. The phone situation started the way these things tend to, gradually. In the early weeks when I rang Colt, he picked up roughly half the time. The other half went to voicemail, and he'd return the call within a few hours, which is perfectly normal for someone with a job. But somewhere around the close of March, the pattern changed. I'd call Colt, and Lacey would answer. Not occasionally, almost every time. She'd pick up his phone in the middle of a weekday afternoon with the smooth efficiency of someone who had settled this question and wasn't interested in revisiting it. "Hi, Vernon. Colt's in the middle of something right now. What do you need?" The first time I figured it was coincidence he was driving and she had his phone. The second time, I assumed a meeting. The third time, I asked whether Colt might be able to call me back when he had a minute, and she said, of course, and he did call back 2 hours later, and the conversation was easy and ordinary. But the structure of things had shifted. I wasn't calling my son anymore. I was routing requests through my son's wife, and my son was responding to whichever ones she decided to pass along. I didn't have language for it at the time. I told myself she was organized. I told myself she was helping him stay on top of a heavy schedule. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation for why a grown man's father could no longer get him directly on his own phone. I was right that there was an explanation. I was wrong about the reasonable part. The grinding in the disposal turned out to be a bottle cap fragment that had worked its way into the shredder ring. Colt dug it out with a pair of needle-nose pliers, and the thing ran fine after that. He held the little bent piece of metal out in his palm, small, obvious, once you knew what you were looking at, and said, "See nothing serious, just something small that got into the wrong place." I have turned that sentence over more times than I can count. He was talking about the disposal, but in the months that followed, every time it came back to me, it sounded like it was describing something else altogether. Something small that got into the wrong place. A machine. A marriage. Maybe what happens to a person when the wrong voice finds the silence that grief hollows out and starts speaking into it. The first amount I noticed was 140. It showed up on my bank statement on a Tuesday morning in the second week of May, listed as an electronic transfer to a vendor name I didn't recognize, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me. I scrolled back through the previous weeks on the app Colt had walked me through, and I found two more. $230 on April 22nd, $350 on May 3rd. All three going to different vendor names, all three in amounts close enough to what a real household bill might run, that you could talk yourself into believing you'd simply forgotten about them. I called Colt that afternoon. He picked up on the third ring, which was unusual. It usually went to Lacey. "Hey Dad, what's up?" I told him I was looking at the account and had found 3 charges I didn't recognize and wanted to know if he had any idea what they were. There was a pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds. And then his voice settled into a register I hadn't heard from him before. Patient with a thin layer of weariness underneath it, the way you sound, when you've explained something to someone multiple times already. "Dad," he said, "those are the subscription services, the streaming ones and the cloud storage. Mom set those up years ago. They just keep renewing automatically." I told him I didn't think Vivian had signed up for anything like that. "She did," he said. "She set up like 4 of them when she got the new tablet. Remember, you were out in the garage. She called you in to show you, and you said you didn't see the point of paying for TV when there was perfectly good free TV. She laughed at you." I did remember the tablet. I remembered saying something about free TV. I could not find the subscriptions in my memory. "Maybe you're right," I said. "I'm sure it's fine." He said, "I'll look into it, okay? Don't stress about it." I said, "Okay." I hung up and sat at the kitchen table with the phone face down in front of me, and I did something I'm not proud of and want to be honest about, because I think plenty of people have done the same thing without recognizing it for what it is. I tried to remember. I worked at it. I went back over that afternoon with the tablet. I could see the kitchen. I could see Vivian at the counter with the device in her hands. I could hear my own voice making the remark about free TV. But the moment of her setting up the subscriptions, the specific act of it, I couldn't locate it. And I thought, maybe I'm not recalling it correctly. Maybe I was in the garage. Maybe she did, and I just wasn't paying attention. I was 68 years old, 14 weeks out, from losing my wife of 40 years, and my son had just handed me a specific, detailed, entirely plausible account of something that had been nagging at me. The path of least resistance, the one that cost the least energy and inflicted the least pain, was to conclude that the fault was in my memory and not in his honesty. So, that is the conclusion I reached. Now, I need to tell you about Lyle Crenshaw because Lyle matters to what's coming, and I want you to know who he is before he becomes important. Lyle Crenshaw was 63 years old and had lived at the far end of Camellia Court for 22 years. Retired electrician, commercial and industrial, his whole working life. The kind of man who handles problems quietly and doesn't make a thing of it. He and his wife Betty had been our neighbors since 2000. Vivian had traded tomatoes from her garden for Bet's fig preserves every summer for 18 years. Lyle and I had shared a case of Coors Light on his back porch the night the Fresno Kings made the playoffs in 2001, and neither of us had mentioned it since, which is the precise variety of friendship that men of a certain generation do best. In early June, I mentioned to Lyle across the back fence that I'd missed a doctor's appointment, my cardiologist Dr. Callister, over on Herndon Avenue. I'd been seeing him twice a year since 2016 for a minor arrhythmia that needed monitoring but not medication. I told Lyle I could have sworn the appointment was on a Thursday, but when I called the office, they said I hadn't been in since the previous November, and my next appointment wasn't on their books at all. Lyle leaned on the fence post and looked at me steadily and said, "Did you reschedule it yourself?" I told him I hadn't. I told him Colt had offered to take over my medical scheduling, along with everything else he'd been handling, and I'd handed it off to him. Lyle said, "Vernon, how many appointments have you missed?" I told him I thought maybe 2, possibly 3. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at the fence post he was resting on. Then he said, "I think you ought to be making those calls yourself from now on." I told him I appreciated it, but was certain there had been some scheduling mix-up. Lyle nodded slowly and said, "Probably." But there was something riding underneath that word that I didn't think to look at until later. 2 weeks after that conversation, I needed to print a copy of my homeowner's insurance declaration page for a contractor coming to look at the roof. My printer had been acting up, and Lyle had offered the use of his months back, so I walked down with a USB drive. His wife Bet sat with me at their kitchen table while the document loaded. Except it didn't load. Bet frowned at the screen and said, "Vernon, it's asking for a login. It says the password on this email account has been changed." I told her that couldn't be right. I hadn't changed any passwords. She turned the screen so I could see it. The email account, the one Vivian had helped me set up in 2018, was locked. And in the recovery options where a backup address is supposed to live, there was an address I'd never seen before. 7 characters in a sign, and a domain I didn't recognize. Bede said quietly, "Honey, do you know whose address that is?" Something went tight in my chest that had nothing to do with the arrhythmia Dr. Callister monitored twice a year. I sat at Bet Crenshaw's kitchen table and looked at that recovery address on the screen. Something that had been resting at an odd angle in the back of my mind for weeks began to settle into a shape I could finally trace the edges of. I told Bet I didn't know whose address it was, but I had a strong feeling I knew whose hands had last been on that account. That evening, I called Faye. My sister picked up on the second ring the way she always does, and I laid it all out for her: the missed appointments, the charges, the email. Everything in sequence, the way you arrange components on a workbench before beginning a diagnosis. When I finished, Faye was quiet for 4 full seconds. For Faye, that's a long time. Then she said, "Vernon, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think before you answer. When is the last time you made a decision about your own life without checking with Colt first?" My mouth came open and then shut again because I had no answer. 4 months of choices, and not one of them had been mine alone. Faye's question lodged in me for 3 days. I let those 3 days pass without picking up the phone to call Colt. Not because I'd reached any conclusion, or because suspicion had sharpened into something I could act on. It was simpler than that. Faye had put a question to me, and I could not answer it honestly, and that inability was the thing I needed to sit with. The honest answer was that I had no memory of the last time I'd chosen something on my own. That answer sat in my chest, the way a misplaced tool sits in the wrong drawer. You're aware of it every time you reach in there. You pull the drawer open. You look at the thing. You still can't work out where it goes. On day 4, I picked up the phone and dialed Colt the old way without rehearsing it first. I had a question about the insurance forms and the roofer who was scheduled to come out for an estimate. No answer. 20 minutes later, Lacey rang me back. "Colt's tied up in a meeting," she said. "What did you need about the roof?" I told her not to worry about it, that I'd sort it out myself. A pause came, not an empty one, a weighted one. Then, "Vernon, that's what we're here for. You don't need to carry all of this by yourself anymore." I said I appreciated that. She said, "That's what family is for." I set the phone down, and those words just sat there. That is what family is for. 6 words that feel like an embrace and operate like a latch turning. What happened with the neighborhood came on gradually enough that it nearly got past me. Nearly. Bud and Alma Kettner had been across the street from me for 14 years. Solid people. Bud had retired from a career as a high school principal. Alma gave piano lessons out of their front room, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And if the wind came from the right direction, you could pick up the sound from my porch, something Vivian had always loved. 14 years of Bud lifting his hand from his driveway every morning when I pulled out. Alma showing up at my door with a casserole the week Vivian died, and then sitting across from me for a full hour without once trying to plug the quiet with small talk, which is as generous a thing as most people will ever do for you. Come June. Bud's wave disappeared. Not suddenly. He made no announcement. It faded out like someone easing a dial down over weeks. And I only recognized it one morning when I noticed I'd reversed out of the driveway 3 separate times, without him so much as glancing up from the edge of his yard. Alma had stopped holding my gaze when we'd end up at the curb together on trash day. A tight little nod, and she'd be gone. I raised it with Lyle one Thursday evening near the end of June, talking over the back fence. Lyle set down the garden hose he'd had in his hand and faced me straight on. "Vernon, there's something I have to tell you, and I'm asking you to let me get all the way through it before you say anything." I told him to go on. Roughly 6 weeks back, Lyle said Colt had come around. First to Lyle's door, then he watched him cross to the Kettners, then over to the Hendersons at the corner. Pleasant the whole time. Said he was just giving the neighbors a heads up that since Vivian's passing, you'd been experiencing some difficulties with your memory, that you'd sometimes get mixed up about what had or hadn't been said, get things sideways from how they actually happened, and he figured it was better for people to know ahead of time, so nothing got blown out of proportion. I stood there on my side of the fence, looking at Lyle Crenshaw, 22 years. We'd been neighbors, and something shifted in my face that I had no power over. Not tears, tighter than tears, a pressure that builds just behind the eye sockets and wants out. Lyle said, "I told him I'd known you since long before he moved into that house in Clovis, and that you seemed as sharp as you'd ever been to me. But Vernon," he stopped there. He reached back down for the garden hose and studied it. "I said he went up and down this street and told everyone I'd lost my mind. Lyle said he used the word confused. That was the word confused. And the way he said it, according to Lyle, was like a son carrying a private worry he didn't want to burden anyone with, but felt obligated to share. That's what made it stick. That is what made it stick, not malice. Care." Colt had worked his way along Camellia Court with a performance of fatherly concern, and the whole block had soaked it up the way parched ground takes rain fast and total, because the story fit. Parents age, kids get worried. That shape already exists in people's heads. It slots right in without any effort. I went back inside, took my chair by the front window, and spent a long time thinking about the 35 years I'd spent diagnosing machinery. A failing machine will often throw off readings that look completely normal. Everything appears to be functioning. The unit runs, but the fault is buried in a component nobody is checking, because there's been no reason to look there. The only way you ever find it is to put down your instruments and trust your hands instead. I'd been going by the instruments. That evening I drove out to the rec center on Shields Avenue where Coach Rico Fuentes held an adult fitness class Tuesday and Thursday nights. Rico was 61, a former high school baseball coach who'd known Colt since the boy was 12 right through to graduation, and who'd remained part of my life the way a few rare people do, present at the margins never demanding attention for it. He was working his way around the equipment with a rag when I walked through the door, and he read my face in about 1 second and said, "Sit down, Vernon." I took a spot on the bench against the wall, and I walked him through all of it. The subscriptions, the email, the appointments, and then what Lyle had just laid on me about the neighborhood. I gave it to him in sequence front to back, leading to effect, because that is how my mind is built, and it is the only method I have for working through something I haven't figured out yet. Rico sat through the whole account without a word, which is rarer than people think. When I got to the end, he lowered himself onto the bench next to me, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "That boy used to share his lunch with the whole team. Every single game day his mom packed extra and he'd hand it out before warm-ups." I said, "I know." Rico said, "That doesn't mean what you're describing isn't happening. It just means it didn't start there." The drive home was dark, and I idled in the driveway a while before I could make myself go inside. From the street, the house on Camellia Court glowed with that warm interior light. The same light it had shone for 40 years when Vivian was moving around in there. For just a moment, one moment, I gave myself permission to forget that she wasn't. Then I went in and rang Faye and told her what Lyle had said. No hesitation from Faye this time. She said, "Vernon, take down this name. Her name is Audra Wentworth, elder law practices in Fresno, and she's very good. Write it down right now." So I did. I put Audra Wentworth's name and number on the back of an envelope and tucked it into the kitchen drawer, where Vivian had always stored things that mattered: the flashlight spare batteries, the folder stuffed with appliance warranties stretching back to 1993. I didn't call Audra Wentworth that night. I reasoned that I needed more time to think it through. I reasoned I hadn't gotten to certainty yet. I sat in that kitchen and reasoned my way through a list of things, most of which held some truth, and none of which were the full truth. The full truth was that dialing a lawyer over your own son is a threshold you can't step back across once you've crossed it, and I wasn't prepared to cross it. January had claimed Vivian. July was going to demand that I face what Colt had done, and I could not bring myself to lose both of them inside a single year. So I held off, and while I was holding off, July came. The first anniversary of Vivian's death landed on a Wednesday. I had been carrying it in my thoughts for weeks already, the way you carry something. You have no way to brace for circling the perimeter of it, never quite closing in. Like a man stalling in front of a repair job he can already tell is going to be worse than it appears. The night before, I went out to the garage and retrieved Vivian's clay pot. She grew lavender in every summer, the one that had lived on the back patio. I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen counter so that something of hers would share the room with me come morning. I was up at 5:30, had been every day for months. I made the coffee the way Vivian made it. 2 scoops stronger than the can, calls for which she always held, was the only defensible method, and which I always said would land one of us in a cardiac ward, and which I have made that same way every single morning since she died, because it is the nearest thing I have to her voice at that hour. I was at the cemetery on Kings Canyon Road before 8. I brought white roses because white was what she always asked for, not red, never red. She used to say red roses were for people who hadn't given it any real thought. I sat with her for a while, and I spoke to her the way I'd been speaking to her since January. Out loud, no apology for it, because there is nobody in a cemetery at 7:30 on a Wednesday morning, and even if there had been, it wouldn't have changed anything. I told her about Colt, the email, the appointments, what Lyle had reported about the neighborhood canvas. I told her there was a lawyer's name sitting in the kitchen drawer, and I hadn't yet decided whether I could bring myself to use it. I told her I wished she were here because she would have seen all of this clearly 3 months ago and spared us both a great deal of difficulty. I drove back and cooked. Her chicken and rice soup, the one built around bay leaves and celery root, written out on an index card in 1988, kept in the recipe box on the second shelf of the cabinet above the stove. I made a full pot because Colt had said he'd try to come by and I wanted there to be plenty. I set 2 places at the table. I put out the good bowls, the ceramic ones we'd picked up at a craft fair in Oakhurst in 2006. I sat down at 1:30 and waited. At 3:00, I transferred the soup into containers and put them in the refrigerator. At 4:15, my phone rang. Colt. My chest did what it does when you've been waiting on something you both wanted and feared, a kind of tightening that isn't quite either one. I picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Dad," Colt said. "Glad I caught you. Listen, I'm really sorry about today. Everything blew up at work and we just couldn't make it happen. How are you holding up?" I told him I was all right. He said, Good. Hey, I actually wanted to catch you about something. A little embarrassing, but we're squeezed this month. The clinic's quarterly payment landed at the same time as some other things coming due. I was wondering if you could spot us $12,500 just to get us through to the 15th. I'll pay it back the moment the receivables come in, 2 weeks at most. I sat at that kitchen table where I had laid out 2 bowls 4 hours earlier, and I looked across at the cabinet above the stove, where Vivian's recipe box sat on the second shelf, and I didn't say anything for a moment. Colt said, "Dad, you still there?" I said, "I'm here." He said it would really help them out and that he wouldn't be asking if it wasn't necessary. I told him I'd think on it and get back to him. He said he appreciated it, said he was genuinely sorry about today and that they'd make it right soon. Maybe next weekend a proper visit, bring food, spend real time together. He sounded like he meant every word. He had been sounding like he meant things for 6 months. I hung up and stayed at that table a long while. 3 weeks after that, I drove out to Colt and Lacey's place in Clovis to drop off a tool he'd asked to borrow, a pipe cutter I'd owned since before he was born. I hadn't called ahead because I was not yet in the habit of telephoning before visiting my own son's house, a habit I was apparently now going to need to form. Lacey answered the door. From somewhere behind her in the living room came voices, women's voices, laughter. She stepped out onto the porch rather than opening the door wider. She said, "Vernon Colt isn't here right now." I held up the pipe cutter and said, "I'd only come to drop it off." She took it without looking at it. Then she said, "Actually, I'm glad you came by because I've been meaning to mention something. Colt and I really value our privacy, and lately it's felt like boundaries around drop-ins haven't been quite there. Going forward, it would mean a lot if you could text ahead before coming over, just so we have a heads up." I looked at my son's wife on the porch of the house I had contributed $40,000 toward purchasing 6 years ago. I thought about that $40,000. I thought about Vivian's recipe box and the soup sitting in containers in my refrigerator at home, and Colt calling 4 hours after his mother's first anniversary to ask me for $2,500. I said, "Of course I'll text first." She said, "Thank you, Vernon. We really do appreciate it." I walked back to my truck and sat in it for 11 minutes before I could start the engine, because that was how long it took for my hands to stop shaking against the steering wheel. Not from anger, I want to be precise about that. It was a different kind of shaking, the kind that comes when something has just confirmed what you were hoping was wrong. When a reading you'd been holding out hope on turns out to be exactly what you feared. I drove home, pulled Audra Wentworth's number out of the kitchen drawer, and dialed. Audra Wentworth's office was on Fulton Street, 4th floor, a corner suite with windows overlooking the park and a waiting room that carried the specific silence of a place where people sit, holding things they haven't yet said out loud. Her assistant offered me water when I arrived. I held the cup for 10 minutes without drinking any of it. Audra Wentworth was 54 years old, precise in the manner of someone who has spent decades working with documents, and she heard everything I had to say without writing a single thing down, which I would later understand was intentional. She preferred to take in the full shape of a situation before she put pen to paper. When I finished, she asked 3 questions. How long had Colt had access to my accounts? Whether Vivian had left a will or a trust? Whether I had records of the withdrawals? I told her 6 months of authorized access, a living trust naming me as sole beneficiary, and a bank app on my phone holding 6 months of statements I hadn't yet printed out. She said, "Mr. Hadley, before our next meeting, I want you to do something. Go to your bank in person, not through the app, and ask for printed statements going back 24 months. Bring them to me, and don't discuss this meeting with Colt or Lacey." I told her I understood. She said, "One more thing. Don't change anything yet. Leave the account alone. Don't remove Colt's access. Don't confront him. The moment he realizes you're looking, the whole picture shifts." I drove home with those instructions sitting in me, the way a level reads when it's true, flat, and absolutely certain. The Saturday after I met with Audra, I decided to clean out the garage. I want to say why, because it matters. I hadn't touched it properly in 8 months, not in the way it actually needed. Vivian had always called the garage my territory and kept clear of it, which was both accurate and her way of letting me know she wasn't going to answer for whatever condition it was in. 8 months of grief and distraction, and Colt ringing every morning, and Lacey walking the perimeter of my backyard, had left the place in a state the earlier version of me, the one who existed before January, would not have tolerated. I needed to work with my hands at something that had a defined start, a defined finish, and a visible result when it was done. That was the garage. I worked through the whole morning, reorganized the tool wall, rehung the socket set in the proper size, ordered the way it belonged, broke down 3 boxes of old service manuals I'd been holding on to for no reason, except that discarding 30 years of technical documentation felt like conceding something. I pulled the old metal shelving unit away from the back wall to sweep behind it. What's coming next is the moment I had been moving toward without fully knowing it, and what I found would reframe everything I thought I understood about the people closest to me. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If someone you loved was working against you quietly, would you confront them the moment you suspected it, or would you wait and gather every last piece of proof first? That's when I noticed the edge of it, poking out a tin box, rectangular, roughly shoebox-sized dark green, a little brass clasp on the front. It was tucked onto a 2x4 ledge running along the base of the back wall, pushed in deep enough that moving the shelving unit was the only way you'd ever find it. Vivian had placed it there. I understood this without having to reason through it. 40 years, with a person teaches you to read their choices. Nothing about where that box sat was accidental. That ledge was not a place things drifted to on their own. Putting something there was a decision to keep it out of sight until the right moment, until someone came looking with purpose. I lowered myself onto the shop stool and kept the box on my lap unopened for a while. When I finally undid the clasp, I found a spiral notebook inside small format, the same make she'd slipped into her coat pocket nearly every day for 2 decades, a rubber band around it keeping it closed. Underneath the notebook, a photograph. Colt at 12 posed beside my service truck on a Saturday morning, his face carrying that particular grin kids wear when they're somewhere they chose to be. The back of the photo was written in his hand, not hers, the deliberate block print of a boy putting something down carefully, because it matters. One day I will work with Dad. I balanced the photo on my knee and opened the notebook. Vivian had been filling it for 14 months before she died. Every entry had a date on it. The earliest went back to November of 2020, 14 months before she passed. It said, "Colt brought up the house value again today. 3rd time this year. Every time it comes up, Lacey is right there with him. And she's the one steering the follow-up questions. Colt doesn't seem to register that he starts these conversations, and she's the one who lands them." I moved through the pages at a slow pace. March of 22. Lacey came right out and asked me whether we'd revisited our estate paperwork lately. I said we had our own attorney handling things and left it there. She gave me a smile and said she only wanted to make sure our future was taken care of. 31 years as a nurse. I've learned to tell the difference between someone looking out for your future and someone keeping an eye on it for themselves. June of 22. Colt spoke to Vernon on the phone this afternoon in a tone I've never heard him use before. Short, brittle, like a man with somewhere else to be waiting on a delay he's had enough of. Vernon didn't pick up on it. He never does. He doesn't look for that in Colt because it hasn't occurred to him to look. That's the thing I keep coming back to. September of 22. I've been thinking that Lacey has always been further down the road of this marriage than Colt has. She knew what it was for before he did. He's been catching up to her blueprint ever since. I'm not certain he's yet grasped the full shape of what he agreed to. The last entry in the notebook was dated 4 days before they admitted her to the hospital. Her handwriting had tightened up by then, grown smaller and shakier, the script of someone whose body was rationing its strength for other tasks. What she wrote: I may not have enough time to say everything, so I'll go straight to what matters most. Vernon won't see it coming, because loving that boy has always meant more to him than being right. That quality is one of the finest things in him. It is also what makes him a target. The money is in the trust. The house is in the trust. On paper, he's covered. Paper can't shield a man who hasn't yet accepted that he's in danger. And then directly below, in the most controlled lines on the entire page, as though she'd drawn a breath and steadied herself before writing, if you're reading this, I'm no longer here to put myself between you and what's coming your way. I'm sorry I couldn't hold on longer, but you have always had more in you than you knew Vernon. You just needed something that needed fixing. I sat on that stool in the garage on a Saturday afternoon in August and wept in a way that had nothing in common with the quiet kind of crying. It came from deep in the body, the sort that fills a space entirely and pays no attention to how it sounds. I'm not sure how long I was there. Long enough that by the time I registered someone knocking at the garage door, the afternoon light cutting through the side window had gone amber. It was Rico Fuentes. He was carrying a paper bag from the diner on Shaw Avenue, 2 coffees, and what turned out to be a slice of peach pie. He said, "Faye rang me. Hope you don't mind." I told him I didn't. He dragged over the other stool, sat down, and kept quiet for a stretch of time, which has always been one of the things I respect most about Rico Fuentes. He passed me a coffee, took in the notebook still lying open across my knee, and said in a low voice, "She knew." I said she knew the whole thing, and she put it in writing so I'd have it when I needed it. Rico held his cup in both hands and studied the concrete floor for a good long moment. Then, "That woman loved you something fierce, Vernon." I said, "I know." He said, "So what's your move?" I handled it the way I'd handle any diagnostic question where I don't yet have the complete picture. "Not sure yet," I said, "but I'm going to find out." He finished his coffee, gave a nod, and headed out, leaving me with the notebook and the photograph and 2 cups going cold. I stayed until the amber faded to gray, running Vivian's final pages through my hands. The way you handle a part you're trying to diagnose, turning it, feeling for where it gave way. The Monday after that, I drove over to our credit union on Blackstone Avenue and put in a request for 24 months of printed statements. The teller who pulled up my account was Marta Godfrey, a woman who'd been at that branch for as long as Vivian and I had held membership there, close to 19 years now. Short salt and pepper hair, reading glasses hung on a beaded chain at her collarbone. She had always known Vivian's name without needing to check a screen for it, which is the sort of small courtesy that runs you nothing and registers with a customer every time. She reviewed my request slip, then raised her eyes above the frames of her glasses and said, "Mr. Hadley, should I be concerned about anything?" I said it was routine, just going over the finances. She watched me for a beat, past what the question called for the pause of someone weighing whether to push or leave it alone. She let it go. "No problem at all," she said. "Give me around 20 minutes. Can I bring you some water?" I took a seat near the window. When Marta came back with the envelope, she placed it on the counter and let her hand rest on top of it for just a second before nudging it my way. Then quietly, "Mr. Hadley, if you go through these and anything catches your eye that you'd like a second set of eyes on, you can ask for me personally anytime." I thanked her and meant every word of it. I brought the envelope home, laid 24 months of statements end to end across the kitchen table, and worked through them, the way Vivian would have, yellow legal pad to one side, pen in hand, starting at the back end and moving toward the present, marking down every outflow I couldn't tie to a known bill, a paper receipt, or a clear memory. By September of 22, I'd covered 2 full pages. Here is the figure I ended up with, and I'll give it to you straight because no other way does it justice. Over those 24 months beginning in September of 22 and running right up to the week, I was sitting at that table while $143,600 had left my accounts without my knowledge or consent, not in a single transfer, not in chunks big enough to trip the bank's automatic alerts. Colt had been deliberate about that. The single largest pull was $4,900, always just below the line that flags for review. The smallest was 115s. Each one landed within 2 days of incoming money, my county pension, arriving on the 3rd of the month, my Social Security, on the 2nd Wednesday. Someone had those dates memorized. Someone was waiting at the spigot every time it opened. $143,600. 24 months, counting from 5 months before Colt pulled up a chair at my kitchen table and told me he just wanted to help me keep track of things. That number stayed with me. I couldn't set it down. Then my phone lit up on the table, a transfer notification from the bank app. $1,800 from Colt Hadley with a note. The note read, "Dad, I can tell money's been on your mind. I've given it some thought and I'd like to pitch in. Consider this a little cushion. Love you." I read those words 4 times through. Then I dialed Faye. First ring she picked up and I read the whole thing to her word for word. She let me finish. 3 full seconds of quiet on the line. Then, "Vernon, don't touch that transfer. Are you listening to me?" No thank you message, no acknowledgement. Don't pick up the phone and call him. "Get Audra on the line first thing tomorrow." I asked her what for. She said, "Because what he sent you has nothing to do with kindness. It's a signal. Either he knows you've been digging, or he's got his suspicions, and what he's showing you is that he can play rescuer just as easily as he played thief." That's all that deposit was. I sat there at the kitchen table, $143,600 on a yellow legal pad, staring up at me, $1,800 freshly placed in my account by the hand that had emptied it. And my mind went to Vivian's notebook, went back to it, and stayed. Her last entry hadn't been about dollars and cents. It had been about how the whole thing was built. He will be protected on paper, she'd written. Paper can't shield a man who hasn't yet figured out that he's a target. I had figured it out. That next Tuesday, I returned to Audra Wentworth's office carrying the legal pad, the printed statements, and a copy of Vivian's notebook, every page photographed on my phone the morning I discovered it. Audra spread the statements across her desk and went to work with a pen, dates marked dollar amounts, circled lines drawn, connecting the withdrawal dates to the deposit dates. 40 minutes she worked, not one word spoken. Then the pen came down and her eyes came up to mine. "Mr. Hadley," she said, "I need to walk you through what I'm looking at because it's going to shape everything that follows. What these statements show is not someone acting on impulse. The dates, the figures, the deliberate effort to stay beneath. Reporting thresholds, this is a calculated pattern. Nobody stumbles into this, and nobody stumbles into starting it." I asked what she meant by reporting thresholds. She said, "Federal law obligates banks to flag cash transactions that exceed $10,000. Anyone who preys on finances for a living knows that rule and builds their withdrawals around it, staying just under the line. The practice has a name structuring. It's a federal crime on its own. Colt may never have looked up the terminology, but he understood how it worked." I asked her where that left me. She straightened in her chair and held my gaze. "Mr. Hadley, as things stand, Colt thinks he has you right where he wants you. I'd rather let him go on thinking that a while longer. Your assignment right now is to do absolutely nothing. Drive home. Be yourself. When Colt phones, answer the way you always have and leave the next moves to me." Heading back on the I-5, the late October sun came at the windshield, the way it does in Fresno. That's time of year, flat low sharp enough to make your eyes water. I turned over 35 years of HVAC work in my mind, the slow failures and the sudden ones. The difference between equipment that simply wears out and equipment that somebody has gotten into and broken on purpose. I pictured Vivian's hands moving across those notebook pages, and I pictured $800 parked in my account, the way you'd park a piece of bait placed there by the man who thought he'd built the trap. No call to Colt that night, no note of gratitude. I turned out the light at 9:30, and I slept soundly better than I had in 8 months, and that fact told me something I wasn't prepared for. What had been pulling me out of sleep all those months wasn't grief. It was the not knowing. Now I knew, keeping up the act turned out to be its own kind of work. 35 years of diagnosing mechanical faults will do this to you. The fundamental law is that knowledge, once it arrives, cannot be sent back. You look at everything differently from that point forward. Every reading carries a meaning it didn't carry before. Colt phoned on a Tuesday evening in early November, same as he'd been doing since February. Same unhurried voice, same thoughtful questions, nothing about them that would raise a flag. I sat in the armchair and held up my end for 12 minutes. We talked about the weather, something I'd caught on the news, whether the Kings had a realistic shot at the playoffs. The whole time, I monitored that conversation the way a technician monitors a gauge he's already caught in a lie. Before he signed off, he asked in passing whether I had gotten the transfer he'd sent through. I told him I had and that it meant something to me. He said, "Of course, Dad. That's what I'm here for." I said goodnight and hung up. Then I walked to the kitchen and poured myself 2 fingers of the scotch Vivian had always kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator for what she called occasions that require sitting down. I lowered myself into a chair and sat with the thought that my son had just inquired casually, like a man confirming a routine payment had gone through, whether I'd noticed the money he'd put back. November moved on. The withdrawals didn't stop. 3 $200 in the first week, 4 $100 in the third. Tuesday evenings Colt called. I answered every time. Basketball weather, the same measured tone I'd been holding for 9 months. After each call, I'd find a quiet corner and stay there until I leveled out. It was early December when the email situation broke open, and it broke open through Lyle Crenshaw, which fit a pattern. More than one crucial turn in this story ran through Lyle Crenshaw. Months earlier, he'd told me to feel free to use his printer anytime, since my own machine had a paper feed issue I'd been putting off. Come the first week of December, I had to print the declaration page from my homeowner's insurance for a roofer coming to quote a job. Thursday afternoon, I showed up at Lyle's place with my laptop, and his wife Bet settled in beside me at the kitchen table while the document pulled up. The email account threw up a wall. Password required. Betty tilted her head and said, "That's odd, honey. Have you changed your password at some point?" I said no, I hadn't touched any of it since Colt had built the account for me, back in 2018. She navigated to the recovery screen and slid the monitor my way. I leaned in close and read what it showed. In the backup email field, the slot reserved for your recovery address was something I'd never laid eyes on. 8 characters in its sign, and a domain that meant nothing to me. I pushed back in Bet Crenshaw's kitchen chair and stared at that address. And what I felt was what a man feels when he's been breathing in a slow gas leak for months and has finally traced it back to the pipe. The opposite of surprise. A cold, settling confirmation, the thing you'd been circling for weeks now, sitting right in front of you, undeniable. Bet said quietly, "Vernon, do you have any notion whose address that could be?" I said I had a fair idea. I drove from Lyle's place directly to Audra Wentworth's office, no call ahead. Her assistant managed to fit me in, between 2 existing appointments, and Audra herself came out to collect me from the waiting room. I followed her to the back office and had barely gotten through the door before I was telling her about the recovery address. She didn't shift in her seat, didn't interrupt. When I ran out of words, she said, "How far back did Colt set that email account up for you?" I told her 2018, 4 years before Vivian passed. She said, "Then for a minimum of 4 years, every financial document that came to you, bank statements, insurance, paperwork, correspondence from your trust attorney, anything tax-related, was being routed to an address you don't own." I said, "That's how it looked to me." She picked up her pen and made a note on the legal pad. Then she set it down, met my eyes, and said, "Mr. Hadley, I need you to hear what I'm telling you, because this development changes our entire approach. What you've just walked me through is unauthorized access to a computer system that's California Penal Code 502, and it also clears the bar for a federal offense under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. This has moved well past a civil dispute. What we're dealing with is criminal behavior, and it's been running for years." I asked her what our next step was. She leaned slightly toward me and said, "We're going to take 3 steps. First, you're going to open a fresh checking account at a bank Colt has never touched somewhere he has no history and no foothold. Second, redirect your pension and your Social Security into that new account before the next payment cycle. Third, leave the old account open with a small balance sitting in it." She stopped a moment. "Not empty. An empty account signals a deliberate choice. I wanted to read like something slipped through the cracks. I asked how much to leave behind. She said $50. I said, why $50? She said, because $50 is the kind of money you discover in a coat you haven't worn since last winter. It's the most accidental looking figure I know. When Colt pulls up that account and finds $50 where $187,000 used to sit, I want his first instinct to be that a transfer misfired somewhere, not that you saw him coming. I want him walking to your door. I let that land for a moment. Then I said, and when he shows up, Audra Wentworth looked straight at me across the desk and said, then I want you prepared. Is there any way to capture what goes on inside your home? I described the old doorbell camera that had quit on me the previous winter. She said, get it working or get a new one. Put it where it covers your front entry. Set it to record around the clock and back up to a cloud account that Colt has no way into. And Mr. Hadley. A brief pause. When he comes, and he will come, I need you to hold back. Don't argue. Don't explain yourself. Don't mount any kind of defense. Give him room to talk. Let him do what he's going to do. The camera will speak for you. You won't need to say a word. I drove home and rang Faye and walked her through everything Audra had told me. Faye said, Vernon, are you doing all right? I said I thought I might be better than all right. She said, good. I've been waiting 9 months to hear you say something like that. The next Monday I went to a credit union on Selin Way that Vivian and I had never set foot in. I opened a checking account in my name only and handed over the redirect paperwork for my county pension and my Social Security, effective the following payment cycle. The woman who processed everything was efficient and professional and didn't ask me anything I wasn't prepared to answer. On my way back, I pulled into the hardware store at Blackstone and Cottage and picked up a doorbell camera for $89. It came in a white box with a house printed on the front and a long list of functions I had no use for, and one I did continuous cloud recording with remote access from a phone. I mounted it that evening, 20 minutes on a stepladder, Vivian's stepladder, the fiberglass one she had insisted on, because she said aluminum conducted electricity, and she hadn't spent 31 years in a cardiac unit to get electrocuted changing a porch light. I stepped down and studied the small lens sitting above the front door, and thought about Vivian's notebook, and the last words she had written to me. You just needed something to fix. I had found it. Nobody tells you about the waiting. Every story like this one has its moment of confrontation, its moment where the truth comes loose and surfaces where people can see it. Those moments get passed around because they have a shape to them. They compress into a sentence, they carry weight. What won't compress into a sentence is the 11 days between bolting a camera above your front door and watching your son step into its frame. I want to account for those 11 days because I think they were the hardest stretch of the whole thing. Harder than coming across the notebook, harder than sitting across from Audra Wentworth and hearing the phrase criminal conduct spoken calmly in a quiet office on Fulton Street, harder than any single moment before or after. That particular kind of hard doesn't photograph well. It doesn't resolve into clean story beats the way that most of what's genuinely difficult in a life refuses to. The pension payment was due on the 3rd of the month. Social Security landed on the 2nd Wednesday. I had filed the redirect paperwork at the new credit union, and the woman who handled it said to allow one full payment cycle for the switch to go through, which meant I was watching the calendar toward the 3rd of February. Colt called on a Thursday night, 4 days after the camera went up. I was at the stove making a grilled cheese sandwich, what I fall back on for dinner, when I have nothing left for cooking and don't want to think about it. The phone went off on the counter, his name on the screen, and my hand paused on the spatula handle for a beat before I answered. He said, "Just checking in, Dad. How are you doing?" I told him I was fine. I said the weather had turned cold for Fresno, nothing serious. I mentioned I'd been watching a documentary series on the national parks, the kind of thing Vivian would have liked. He said that sounded good. He asked if I was running low on anything from the store. I told him I was set on groceries. He said he and Lacey had been talking about coming by for dinner, maybe the weekend after next. I said that sounded nice, and I'd put something decent on the table. We talked for 9 minutes. I know because I checked the call log afterward the way you check a timestamp on a service record to confirm the sequence holds. When I put the phone down, I stood at the stove watching the grilled cheese go from golden to slightly overdone on one side because I'd let myself get distracted and didn't flip it in time. And I sat with the thought that I had just spent 9 minutes discussing documentary series and grocery runs with my son while $50 rested in our old account like a lure dropped into still water. Saturday morning, Lyle Crenshaw knocked at the back door. At 8:15, 2 cups of coffee from the place on Shaw Avenue in hand. He did this from time to time, had been doing it for years, and I'd always been glad for it, without making a show of it, which is the understanding Lyle and I have always had. He set 1 cup on the counter and kept the other, and leaned against the doorframe and said, "How are you holding up?" I told him I was holding. He said, "You sleeping?" I said, "Mostly." He said, "Vernon, for whatever it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing, and I think Vivian would think so too." I told him that meant something to me. I meant it all the way to the floor. He drank the rest of his coffee and headed out. I stood in the kitchen with mine and let myself think about Vivian for a while. Not the Vivian of the notebook, not the Vivian of the hospital corridors, but the Vivian of an unremarkable Saturday morning, the one who would have been at that counter with her own cup reading from her tablet, occasionally lifting her eyes, and reading a line out loud because she'd decided I needed to hear it. I thought about how much of a life is built out of those ordinary Saturday mornings, and how completely they vanish when someone is gone, not slowly, not by degrees, but all at once like a switch thrown in the dark. I didn't cry. I had done my crying out in the garage back in August, the kind that hollows something out and leaves it cleaner. What moved through me on that particular Saturday was something quieter, something without an edge, a settled weight that had taken up a permanent address somewhere inside me, and that I was learning in small increments to carry without letting it pull me off balance. Sunday night, I did something I want to set down here because I believe it belongs in the telling. I was up at 2 hours in the morning. I'm not sure what brought me out of sleep, a sound, a dream, or just that particular quality of 2 a.m. that turns a man's thoughts up louder than they have any business being. I walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and stood at the counter with my phone in my hand. I stayed on Colt's name in my contacts for a long time. Everything in me wanted to place that call. Not to corner him, not to lay any accusation at his feet. Just a phone call, just to say, "Colt, I know what's been going on and I need you to sit with me in that for a minute. Whose idea was this? Is there still anything left of the kid who stood beside me in the garage, passing me tools and asking what each one was called? Because I need to believe that boy is still somewhere inside you. And that what's unfolding now is something that wandered in from outside, the way a bottle cap finds its way into a garbage disposal, and not something that took root in him on purpose." 6 minutes I stood at that counter holding the phone. Then I laid it face down and walked myself back to bed. Not out of strength, I won't pretend that. I put it down because Audra's words came back to me. Let him come to you. Whatever he decides to do, let him do it. The camera speaks for you. And then I thought about something Vivian had written down. He will be protected on paper. What paper has no power over is a man who hasn't yet convinced himself he needs that protection. I held on to that. I needed it to hold for a few more days. February 1st, 30 in the morning, I pulled up the new account. The pension had come in overnight, full amount, nothing missing, sitting clean in the account Colt had no knowledge of. I poured my coffee and took it to the kitchen table and sat there staring at that figure on my phone for longer than I should have. Then I dialed Audra Wentworth's office and left a message the redirect had gone through. After that, I called Rico Fuentes. "It starts now," I told him. Rico asked if I was ready. I sat with that question. I thought about $50 parked in an old account like bait in a trap. I thought about a small camera over a front door. I thought about a notebook sealed in a tin box and the woman who'd seen every inch of this coming and loved me well enough to draw me a map before she left. "I've been ready since August," I said. The deposit cleared at 11:47 Thursday night. I remember the exact time because I'd been checking my phone each night before sleep for 11 days running, and on this night, the number I'd been waiting on was finally there, resting in the new account, at the new credit union on Selland Way, every dollar of it present and correct. I put the phone on the nightstand. I stretched out in the dark and lay still and thought tomorrow. However this goes, tomorrow is when it begins. I got 4 hours of sleep, on my feet at 5:15, dressed by 5:30, coffee brewed by 5:40. I settled into the armchair near the front window, both hands wrapped around the mug, and I watched the street outside shift through its colors, black, then gray, then that thin, clean, pale blue that Fresno mornings carry in February when the valley fog has burned off and the air bites a little. The camera feed sat open on my phone, the live view, a small bright rectangle framing the front porch and the walkway down to the street, still quiet in the early light. At 6:04, 2 shapes came up the path. I set the mug down. I got to my feet. Colt was in front, his stride quick and purposeful, the gait of a man who'd been locked inside a car for the whole drive over, stoking himself and hit the ground still burning on whatever he'd built up along the way. The gray jacket, the one I didn't recognize, the one I'd seen him in once before. His face on the camera feed was locked down tight set, hard in a way I hadn't seen since his teenage years, when he used to carry an anger bigger than he knew what to do with. Lacey came 3 paces behind him, her coat done up to the chin. Her face carried something specific, the look of a woman who's arrived somewhere she's already decided belongs to her. 4 heavy knocks landed before I got to the door. Open palm, no hesitation, not a request, not a greeting. I pulled it open. Colt walked past me without pausing. He went straight to the center of the front room and spun around, and his voice arrived already at full volume, like pressure that had been building. The whole drive finally found a release valve. Where is it? The account's showing $50. $50, Dad. What did you do with the money? I said, which money are you referring to? Colt, his jaw went rigid. Don't, please don't. The inheritance. Vivian's money. $187,000. 4 days ago, it was there. And right now, the account says $50, and you're going to tell me where it is. Behind him, Lacey hadn't broken stride. She peeled off down the hallway, no words, no glance in my direction, no hesitation. I heard Vivian's bedroom door swing open. I heard the closet track give its familiar slide. I heard the top drawer of Vivian's dresser ripped out hard, the pull of someone who doesn't know that piece of furniture, who yanks where you're supposed to lift. Slightly the gentle trick of it that Vivian had worked out over decades, the motion I'd watched her perform 10,000 times across 40 years. I heard the jewelry chest, the wooden box with the brass clasp that Vivian's mother had passed down to her. I heard Lacey wrench it open. Colt moved a step closer, and his voice fell low, which landed harder than the shouting had. Dad, I'm not playing around. That money is this family's. Tell me what account you put it in and hand over access. Right now. I stood there looking at my son in my own front room at 6 in the morning, demanding an accounting of savings his mother had built up over 31 years on nursing shifts. And something shifted inside my chest that I want to name correctly because it matters. It wasn't rage. Rage was what I'd braced for, and this was something else entirely colder, more settled. The sensation of a verdict arriving after a long wait. A question that had finally stopped being a question. Bolt, I said, that money is mine. Vivian left it to me through a trust. That's not news to you. He said, you're 68 years old living by yourself, and $187,000 is more than you can keep track of in an account you can barely manage. We've shown up for you. Every week handling things, and you turned around and moved it without a word to anyone. I said, I wasn't aware I owed you that conversation. His voice fractured on the next word. Yes, he said. You do. You absolutely do, because we have built our lives around being here for you, and you just pulled the rug out from under everything without a single conversation. Built our lives around being here for you. Sit with that sentence. My son spoke those words in my living room at 6 in the morning, and they didn't register to him as anything unusual, and I have picked them apart in my head every single day since the particular construction of them. How they flipped the whole thing upside down. How they reframed his presence in my life as some kind of ongoing sacrifice on my behalf, rather than the operation it actually was. From somewhere deep in the house, there came a sound I hadn't steeled myself for even knowing it was on its way. Vivian's bedside table drawer, not eased out too far, but sent completely off its runners, crashing down onto the hardwood, everything inside it flung across the floor. And then that specific quiet that settles over a room when something that cannot be replaced has just been handled like it's trash. Something came through me then that had nothing cold in it at all. Colt covered the distance in 4 strides, and his hands shot up and locked into my collar, both fists twisting the fabric, and he drove me backward until my shoulder blades found the wall beside the coat hooks. The plaster stopped me. I felt the coat hooks bite into the back of my right arm. Colt's face was 8 inches from mine. His eyes were red at the outer corners, the kind of red that comes from nights without sleep, from hours spent in the dark, nourishing something that deserved to be left alone. You are going to tell me the name of that account, he said. 11 days I had been turning this moment over, what it would feel like when it arrived, what I'd do, what I'd say. I had also thought about what I was capable of doing. I am 68 years old, and I put in 35 years hauling compressor units and air handlers up staircases and through attic hatches, and there is a great deal more left in my arms and shoulders than my son had bothered to consider. I could have planted both palms on his chest and walked him across that room the same way you move a heavy appliance, measured unhurried, no performance required. I didn't do that. I let my son pin his father against the wall of the house his father had owned for 40 years. I let him keep me pinned there, his fists wound into my collar, his face close enough that I could smell the coffee he'd had on the drive over. I didn't raise a hand. I didn't resist. I looked up. The camera sat mounted in the corner above the front door, matty black against the white trim, that small red indicator light pulsing in its slow, even rhythm. It had been capturing everything for 11 days. It was capturing this. I held my eyes on it for 2 full seconds. Then I brought them back to my son. I said, "Colt, this is the first time in your life I have ever wanted you to hear yourself the way other people hear you." He didn't follow me right away. I watched it move across his face in stages, confusion first, then a flash of irritation, and then the moment his gaze drifted upward and found the lens and the blinking light, and something happened to his expression that I don't have an exact word for. Not guilt, not quite. Not fear, not quite. It was the look of a man who has just understood that the room he believed he was running has had eyes on him from the start. His hands let go. Not slowly, not by degrees, all at once the way hands release when the brain catches up and sends the signal that overrides everything the body was doing. He stepped back. Then another step. From the hallway, Lacey came into view. One glance at Colt's face, then her eyes traced the same path his had and landed on the camera above the door. Her mouth came open and stayed that way for a beat. She said, "You're recording us. You can't do that." I said, "It's my house. It's a security camera on my own front door. I can do exactly that." She said, "Colt, just his name, nothing else. The way you say a name when the situation has shifted and you need the other person to catch up without spelling it out." Colt said nothing. He was still watching the camera. Lacey turned and went back down the hall. I heard the back door open and then close. Colt stayed where he was for another 10 seconds, motionless, silent, staring at that lens with an expression I had never seen on him before, and hope I never see again. Then he walked out through the front door without another word. I stood alone in the front room, in the quiet of a February morning, and listened to their car fire up at the curb and pull away, and I didn't move until the engine sound had gone completely. Then I picked up my phone and dialed Audra Wentworth. She picked up on the second ring. I told her they had come. I walked her through what Colt had said, what Lacey had done in the back of the house, what the camera had caught. I told it the way I always tell things in sequence, start to finish, nothing skipped. When I was done, she held the line for exactly 1 second. Then she said, "Mr. Hadley, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, don't touch the camera or the recording. Second, don't contact Colt or Lacey. Third, call 911 and report what happened. Tell them your son entered your home without invitation, made physical contact with you, and that you have it on video. Can you do those 3 things?" I told her I could. She said, "I'll be at your house within the hour." The officer who responded was a young man named Holt, who couldn't have been much past 25, and who sat across from me at the kitchen table and took my statement with a steadiness I was grateful for. I walked him through the camera footage on my phone. He watched it twice. On the second pass, he stopped at the section where Colt had me against the wall. He looked up from the screen and said, "Mr. Hadley, are you aware that what you just showed me constitutes felony elder abuse under California Penal Code 368? Ex bepaonits idorane bahadin died." I told him I had a general understanding of that. Yes. He said, "I'm going to need to make some calls." Audra arrived 40 minutes after that. She took a seat at my kitchen table alongside Officer Holt and opened a folder she had clearly been building from materials I'd handed her over the previous months, statements, the withdrawal pattern, the email redirect, the canceled medical appointments. She laid the whole picture out for him, the way she did everything methodically and without gaps. Holt took notes, asked questions, and at one point stepped outside to make a phone call that ran about 12 minutes. When he came back in, he said a detective from the Fresno Police Department's Elder Abuse Unit would be reaching out within 24 hours. Detective Renata Serrano called the next morning at 9:15. Her voice was measured and unhurried, the voice of someone who has learned through practice that the people on the other end of her calls need room to process what they're hearing. She asked me to take her through everything from the beginning. I did. It took 40 minutes. When I finished, she said she wanted to come by that afternoon to view the footage herself and collect a formal statement. She arrived at 2 Andorra with a partner whose name I didn't catch. She watched the recording 3 times on the camera's cloud app, which I pulled up on my laptop at the kitchen table. On the 3rd viewing, she paused it at the exact moment Colt's hands came off my collar. She said, "Mr. Hadley, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Why didn't you push him off you?" I told her I had been sitting with that question for 11 days, and had decided that what was on that camera mattered more than what I felt like doing in the moment. She looked at me for a beat with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then she said that was the correct decision. Colt's phone was collected under a search warrant 3 days later. I didn't ask about the particulars. What Detective Serrano relayed to me in a follow-up call 2 weeks after that is what I want to set down now, because it's the piece of this that took me longest to sit with and longest to accept. The messages between Colt and Lacey going back 18 months told a story that differed from the one I'd been carrying in one significant way. In February of 2021, 11 months before Vivian died, Colt had sent Lacey a message that said, "I'm not doing this. I don't care what you think the house is worth. I'm not going to pressure my parents about anything." Lacey had written back, "Nobody is pressuring anyone. I'm just saying we should understand what our options are. That's not the same thing." 4 months on in June, Colt had messaged, "This feels wrong. The amounts are getting bigger and Dad hasn't said anything, but I don't know how long that lasts." Lacey had responded, "Your father is 67 years old and he can barely work the TV remote. He's not going to notice. And even if he does, you're his son. What's he gonna do? No question mark." A statement wearing the shape of a question, because the person who wrote it was certain the answer went without saying. I sat in my kitchen with Detective Serrano's voice coming through the phone, reading me those messages. And I thought about Colt at 12 years old, standing beside me in the garage, handing me screws, asking the name of every tool. I thought about the February afternoon 2 years ago, when he'd sat at this same table, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, and offered to help with the bills. I had thought his face was genuine then. I still think it was. I still believe that in that moment he meant what he said. I still think the rot hadn't yet reached the part of him that could sit at a kitchen table with his father. Lacey's message from September of that same year read, "He's not going to suddenly get smart about this. The longer we wait, the more complicated it gets. Either we do this or we don't. Make a decision." Colt hadn't answered for 3 days. Then he wrote, "Okay." 1 word. 3 days of silence, and then 1 word. And that word had cost me $143,600 the relationship with my son and the 18 months that followed. I want to be careful about what I am and am not saying here, because I've had long enough to think about it that I want to get it right. I am not saying Colt was innocent. He was not innocent. He made a decision 1 word, and he followed through on it for 18 months, with enough deliberateness and enough care to stay under bank fraud. Thresholds cancel my medical appointments, walk into a hardware store, and cut a duplicate key to my side gate that I never knew existed. He owns what he did. A choice is still a choice, even when it arrives as a single syllable. What I'm saying is that I had to understand where it began, not for his sake, but for mine. For my ability to get out of bed in the mornings and function in the world. Not to forgive it, to understand it. Those are different things, and the difference matters more than I can easily put into words. If you've ever had to hold a truth about someone you love that carries both their wrongdoing and their humanity in the same hand, you already know what I mean, and there is nothing more for me to explain. The rot had taken root in Lacey's voice in Colt's ear, the same voice that had been there since he was 29 and newly married, still carrying a photo in his wallet of himself, at 12, standing beside his father's truck. Detective Serrano said, "Mr. Hadley, I know this is a great deal to absorb. I'd like to give you some time, and then we should talk about next steps. Does tomorrow morning work?" I said tomorrow morning was fine. I hung up and sat in the kitchen for a while. The afternoon light was coming through the window above the sink, that low-angled February light that catches the tile backsplash Vivian had chosen back in 2002, the pale blue ones she'd driven to 4 different stores to track down. I sat looking at those tiles for a long stretch. Then I got up, made coffee, and went out to the garage, which is where I go when I need to think, and there's nowhere else to be. Detective Serrano returned the next morning at 9, same as she'd said she would. She laid out what the investigation had built: elder financial abuse under California Welfare and Institutions Code, 1561030. Unauthorized computer access under Penal Code 502. Battery of an elder under Penal Code 368. Identity theft charges tied to the email redirect. When she finished, she said, "Mr. Hadley, this is a strong case. The camera footage alone establishes the battery charge beyond any reasonable question. You have more to work with than most victims of elder financial abuse ever see. What you do with it is your decision." She left at 10:15. I sat at the kitchen table until 11. Then I called Faye. She picked up on the first ring. I read her the list of charges. When I was done, she said, "Vernon, what do you want to do?" I said, "I don't want to grind him into the ground, Faye." She said, "I know." I said, "That doesn't make what happened acceptable, but I know where it started. I know whose voice was working on him, and I know what Vivian would say about reducing a person to rubble when another path exists." Faye said, "What's the other path?" I said, "He pays it back, every dollar on a schedule under court supervision, and he stays away from me while he's doing it." Faye was quiet for 5 seconds. Then she said, "Vernon, that is either the wisest thing you've ever said or the most generous thing you've ever said, and I honestly can't tell which." I told her it was just the thing I could live with. I called Audra that afternoon. She listened without cutting in, and when I finished, she said she could work with that, but that whatever I chose, I needed to be choosing it for myself, not for him. Mercy, that's really just anxiety wearing a different face, doesn't serve anyone. I sat with that sentence for a good while after we hung up. That evening, I drove out to Rico Fuentes' place on Copper River Drive. He was washing his truck in the February cold. He listened to what I'd settled on, reached over and turned off the hose, dried his hands on his jeans, and said, "Some people are going to say that's letting him off easy." I said I was aware of that. He said, "Fighting back is the easy one. Anybody can get there." I said, "I'm not doing it because it's harder. I'm doing it because Vivian would have." Rico looked down at the wet driveway. Then he said, "Yeah, she would have." I drove home and sat at the kitchen table with Vivian's notebook open to the last page. "You were always stronger than you knew, Vernon. You just needed something to fix." I closed the notebook, placed it back in the tin box, carried it to the hall closet third shelf from the left, beside the appliance warranties going back to 1993, because Vivian had always kept important things there, and I saw no reason to disturb that now. Then I called Audra and told her to move forward. The plea agreement took 6 weeks to put together. Audra kept me updated at each stage, calling on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, the way a doctor calls with results. The district attorney's office had pushed for more than I'd asked for, which Audra had told me to expect. After 3 weeks of back and forth, it settled into a shape I could recognize. Colt entered a guilty plea to elder financial abuse and unauthorized computer access. Lacey entered a separate guilty plea to unauthorized computer access connected to the email redirect. Restitution was set at $143,600, ordered at $2,380 per month. A no-contact order was issued covering both of them effective immediately upon sentencing. Probation terms were 36 months for Colt and 24 for Lacey, with mandatory financial counseling as a condition of both. Audra called after the sentencing hearing, which I had not attended. She said, "It's done, Vernon. The order is signed." I said, "All right." She said, "How are you feeling?" I told her I'd let her know once I figured that out. Lacey was gone before the ink dried. The paperwork was finalized on a Thursday. By Monday, Colt's attorney had notified Audra that Lacey had filed for dissolution of marriage in Fresno County Superior Court and relocated to Reno, Nevada, where her sister lived. Faye called that evening. She said, "Lacey filed for divorce. Are you surprised?" I told her not in the slightest. She said that woman was never in that marriage for Colt. She was in it for what she believed Colt could eventually deliver. Once the delivery stopped, the math changed. That's not a marriage. That's a transaction that ran its course. I said Vivian had worked that out about 3 years before either of us had. Faye said Vivian worked out most things before either of us did. It was aggravating when she was alive, and somehow it's more aggravating now. I laughed. The first time I genuinely laughed since before January of 2022. It came up before I'd decided to let it, the way real laughter does. Colt moved into a studio in Sanger 2 weeks after Lacey left. He picked up a second job at a distribution center off Jensen Avenue, covering warehouse shifts on weekday evenings after his regular hours 6 days a week. The first payment landed on the 1st of the month, $2,380. I looked at the deposit notification for a long time. What I felt wasn't satisfaction, wasn't relief, wasn't anything with a clean label. It was closer to what you feel when a machine you have spent a long time repairing finally runs the way it should. Not joy. More the absence of the wrong sound. The grinding stops, the system runs. You stand there and recognize that this is what it was always supposed to sound like. Lyle Crenshaw came by on Saturday morning with coffee. He asked about the first payment, and I told him it had come on time. He wrapped both hands around his cup and said, "You know what? I keep coming back to Vivian picking out those tiles above the sink." Bet went with her to 2 stores, said Vivian held 40 different samples up against the window light before she settled on the right blue. I looked at the backsplash. I said she was like that about everything. She didn't settle. Lyle said, "No, she didn't." He finished his coffee, set the cup in the sink the way he always does, and let himself out through the back door, the way neighbors do once the formality has worn off and what remains is just the easy familiar fact of each other. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at those pale blue tiles. She hadn't settled on the tiles. She hadn't settled on me either back at the hardware store on Blackstone Avenue in 1981. She had not settled in the notebook she maintained for 14 months in a tin box in the garage, setting down everything she observed because she knew I was going to need it. I rinsed my cup and set it in the drying rack next to Lyle's. After that, I headed out to the garage. 3 items had been sitting on that workbench long enough, and I was done postponing them. Fresno moved into spring, the way it always does. On its own timetable, no announcement. The lavender in Vivian's clay pot returned without any encouragement from me, the way it always comes back stubborn and quiet. Every Sunday I gave it water, and every Sunday I thought of her. Certain things carry that function. They are made for it. June 1st brought the second payment, July 1st the third, August 1st the fourth. Every one of them exactly $2.80. No cover note, no message attached as dependable as the calendar itself. I made a habit of checking on the 2nd of the month rather than the 1st. A man who watches the clock on the last day of the month waiting for his son's money is not a man I wanted to become. It was Rico Fuentes who brought me into a loose circle of men around my age who gathered Thursday mornings at the diner on Shaw Avenue, Hank Tilford, who'd put in his years as a fire captain before retiring, and Alvin Beckwith, a former history teacher who held the floor more than any of us, but generally had a reason to. 4th Thursday, and Hank brought up my son directly. No setup, no softening. I gave him the condensed version. He said, "Choosing the right move costs something. People don't talk about that cost enough." I told him I was grateful he had. Faye called on a Sunday in August. She wanted to know how I was actually holding up, not the answer I gave when people asked out of politeness. I told her I was managing at a level Vivian would have described as adequately, which coming from Vivian meant you were doing fine. Faye laughed at that. Then she asked whether I got lonely. I said yes sometimes, though not as often as I had braced for. The garage, I told her. That helped. The Thursday mornings helped, Lyle helped, she helped, and Vivian was on that list too. Still on it would always be. Faye said, "Of course she is. She'll be on every list I make for the rest of my time on Earth." September. I sanded and refinished the shelves I'd built back when Colt was 8 years old. They came out better than the original work, which is what happens when you finally devote to something the care it always had coming. Lights out at 9:30. No staring at the ceiling. The 9th payment arrived November 1st. I looked on the 2nd the same way I'd been doing it, letting the tide come in first, then checking to find the number already settled and waiting. Tube 380 matching everyone before it. I set my phone on the table and finished my coffee and looked out toward Vivian's lavender in the yard, which had turned woody and silver gray at the base the way it does when the cold moves in. I decided it had been a reasonable year. That is as much as I can honestly claim. At 9:17 that same morning, the phone went off on the table beside me. A name I hadn't seen light up an incoming call in 9 months. Colt. I lifted the phone and watched his name sit there while it rang. Once, twice, 3 times. My thumb lay flat against the glass, not near the green, not near the red, just resting there, while the ringing continued. A question that has been asked keeps hanging in the air until it gets an answer or the moment closes. I turned the phone face down and let it go to voicemail. Not because there was nothing I wanted to say, because the thing that existed between us now had no shape that a phone call could hold. 22 months had taught me to leave things alone until they were actually ready. Back out to the garage. Vivian's old space heater from the back bedroom had occupied one corner of the workbench since August 1st, on my list of 3 the one I'd kept circling around. The The coil housing had developed a crack and the thermostat was running 5 degrees, under which qualifies as minor until enough time passes, and it qualifies as something else. I drew the stool up to the bench, located the correct wrench on the third hook from the left same hook since 1993, and started in. Some problems yield to the right tool and a patient hand. Others need time before you can even know whether they are fixable. I was ready for either outcome. The coil housing separated cleanly when I got the angle right. Old equipment rewards you that way. It was built by people who understood that someone down the line would have to open it, trace the fault, and put it back together. That understanding isn't built into everything anymore. Some things today are engineered to be discarded when they break rather than repaired, and that has always struck me as a poor way to build anything. Vivian's space heater came out of the factory in 1990. 33 years of service. The housing had split at the seam plastic that had gone brittle across 3 decades of expanding and contracting with the heat. The thermostat reading was off by 5 degrees because the bimetallic strip had worn thin. Not exactly a breakdown, more like the machine showing its history. My HVAC instructor, Dwight Fenner, opened the very first class in 1985 with something I haven't forgotten since. He said, "The most dangerous assumption in this trade is that you know what's wrong before you've looked. The job is not to be right. The job is to look carefully enough that you stop being wrong." I had not looked carefully enough. Not at the pattern in the withdrawals, not at the way Lacey's eyes had worked the room that morning, not at the 100 small things I'd filed under reasonable explanations, because that was easier than filing them under what they were. The heater was back together in 40 minutes, steady output, even heat, no surprises. I settled onto the shop stool and looked over at the tin box on the second shelf. Vivian filled that notebook across 14 months of being sick, leaving me something to find, not a farewell so much as a set of tools laid out before she went. The last page said, "You were always stronger than you knew, Vernon. You just needed something to fix. I had fixed what was mine to fix. Whatever comes next runs on its own clock. My son sends $2,380 on the first of every month. Whether anything genuine is moving in him, I have no way of seeing from this distance. I've learned to hold that open. Here is what I do know. The pale blue tiles above the sink, the recipe box on the second shelf, the lavender standing silver, and still in the November cold. If you've stayed with me this long, then you know this was never really a story about money. It was a story about what happens when the people we raised stop seeing us as people. I've had a long time to sit with all of it, the $43,600, the camera above the door, the phone messages Detective Serrano read to me in my own kitchen. What it cost me wasn't just the savings. It was the version of my son I had been holding on to. I believe God allowed me to find that tin box when I did not a moment sooner and not a moment later. Vivian had left me a map, and I was finally ready to read it. If this story reached you, and I think it did, or you wouldn't still be here, then let me leave you with a few things worth carrying. Trust your instincts about money. If a pattern feels wrong, it probably is. Get the statements. Look at the numbers yourself. If someone in your life is controlling your access to information, that is not help. That is control. Name it clearly. Do not confront before you are ready. Preparation is not cowardice. It is the difference between being heard and being dismissed. And if you are facing something like this, if this family, revenge story landed close to home, know that adults 50 plus are not easy targets just because someone decided they should be. You are allowed to fight back. You are allowed to be the one holding the proof. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave me a comment below. I read them, and they matter to me. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourself out there.